Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Jennifer White sent me a text message and she needed to do an update. So we'll just watch for her to join, make her percentage. There she is. Hold on one moment. And I will go ahead and start introducing Jennifer. I'm going to go ahead and read her bio, and I don't believe it does her justice. If anyone was able to attend the provider conference last year, Jennifer was one of our speakers, and she was just a dynamic, wonderful individual. So I'm glad that more people get the opportunity to learn from her. And if you are not already registered for her in person training that is next Thursday here in Salt Lake City, all day, you can still join us by this Adobe Connect series. I know it's a little different to think about attending an all day training via Adobe Connect, but we will have breaks, and Jennifer is very skilled at engaging learners both in person and virtually. So I think it'll be a great opportunity for folks who are not able to make it to Salt Lake City or want to try learning through this method. So Jennifer is a seasoned subject matter expert designing and implementing projects that further implement first strategies in transition programs and community employment agencies across the nation. She specializes in successful business-minded tools, innovative high-tech accommodations, and collaborative design, resulting in structures that sustain successful employment outcomes. She is a corporate consultant supporting affirmative action hiring initiatives of people with the most significant disabilities, starting with the WIN program at Harrison Medical Center. This started in 2006, and this work continues with international Fortune 500 companies. Again, so excited for folks to get to learn from her, and thank you, Jennifer. If you want to go ahead and get started, I'll turn it over to you.
Um, I like to start with this quote from the doctor who worked with Helen Keller. He said to Annie Sullivan, who was Helen Keller's teacher, if a house collapsed in on a child, all of us would come running with pitchforks and shovels. No one would stop digging until the child was found. And that's our task here, to keep digging until we find the child. And he was talking about Helen Keller. At our company, we apply this perspective to everyone we work with, specifically because of the kind of institutionalized marginalization that has happened over decades for this population of people. We look at them as they are under the rubble of hundreds of years of a lack of the appropriate accommodations that we're working on building, but that continuation to continue, to keep trying to find the person, to keep working on understanding what it is they need instead of stopping and assuming kind of we know where they are. We essentially look at the person as the person who's behaving with the best that they've got given what they were given. So we want to keep trying to unearth what might be possible if we raise the bar. What helps us with this perspective is to understand the social justice lens. We are all social justice workers, whether you knew that or not, or whether you look at it that way, right? Our job is to level the playing field for people with disabilities to have the same opportunities you and I have. And in order to do that, we actually found this wonderful book called Beyond Inclusion, Beyond Empowerment by Leticia Nieto. If I'm going to recommend that everybody get a copy of it. It's a curriculum book, so it's pricey. It's $60, but it is well worth it. And the tagline in the book is Strategies to Free Us All. She puts really strong and clear language to having difficult conversations about what can be difficult conversations, but she lays out kind of a really concrete path to look at how we got to where we got and how to move forward. Whether you're a person in the target group or the agent group, and the agent group is essentially the one who has the most power, and the target group is the marginalized group. And she wrote out these 9 categories of marginalized groups of people or target groups where it's not necessarily, the system wasn't necessarily built by these groups. That's essentially what it means. Disability is one of those categories. And this is very helpful for us because social justice issues apply. We think about, okay, all of the women who are online here, how long have we been working on the same earnings for the same hour of work as our male counterparts? My lifetime for certain. I'm 57 years old. It's been in conversation since I was born. And how are we doing? We're still in the 70-cent range. So we know it means that there's a dynamic process that is necessary to address it. That's what this tells us. The social justice lens tells us that there's such institutionalized, embedded assumptions and experience that we need an action plan that is continuous. And so, same, we worked on getting a little black girl in a white school, and how are we doing with race relations in our company right in our country right now? So we want to look at it with that lens because it really helps us understand what our mission is, and also that a dynamic plan is necessary. And by a dynamic plan, I mean in our staff meetings, we address this every week. We do it in specific ways, and I'm going to get to that. But a dynamic plan means ongoing attention so that we can continue to learn about what's embedded and what we don't even pay attention to anymore. So we're looking to raise the bar, especially now that we have access to really cool high-level accommodations. We don't want to bring the same problems with us. There are two areas that we really see regularly are barriers for people with IDD: communication and money. I forgot that I had control of the slide, sorry. So we look at communication first because we serve a lot of people who are non-linguistic. They might have some vocabulary, some signs. They might have anxiety that shuts down communication. And so because it's an ongoing issue, we really want to look at how some of the things that get in our way, or some of the structural issues that we haven't attended to for the last couple of centuries, actually. I talk about this as addressing the injury of the low power status, meeting the feral child. And what I mean by that is my business was structured, and I kind of found this niche of working with people at a lot of behavior and behavior as communication. And what I found is that most people who have had to navigate the system of service, where they're managed all day long, figure out how to take care of themselves. Essentially the feral child. I'm in the woods, I know how to take care of myself. So because our service system is so, the turnover rate is so high that even if I work with you and we get a good thing going, you're going to leave and then I'm going to work with somebody else. And those skill sets are not always carried forward. I essentially have to start again as the non-linguistic person, again and again with a new person. So in that, part of that injury means I have to understand that there's somebody who knows how to take care of themselves. And for me to change habits or to raise the bar means it has to be motivating enough to come out of the woods for. That means I'm not going to start with the hygiene project, or I can't understand whether or not you want to go to work. Even though we might want to know, when are you in pain or what do you want? I can't really find that out until I understand how to get in front of someone with something that's motivating and relational, that's going to give us the opportunity to find the path forward. So we look at how do we structure activities that encourage self-determination. We think about the brain like a file cabinet and start to understand that everybody's going to bring how they've organized things forward, and how the visual brain organizes. So for people with processing issues, so that's everybody with a cognitive disability, has processing variance. They might hear what comes in, but what their brain does with it and how it comes back out are going to be something we don't understand, or we don't have the habit of. So I want to look at the discovery of how does that person interact with information. We look at, there's a research study back in the 70s by Risley and Hart that the statistics are most of what we know we learned incidentally. In fact, 92% of what we know and use as adults, we came across incidentally. Nobody tried to teach us that. So when we're talking about people with cognitive disabilities, we have to understand we're looking at what's in the environment. What model are they relating to? And oftentimes when we're managing folks, the communication and the money models are not as accessible to them. So we're really going to focus on that. But we're also going to focus on how do we model the tools that we want people to be able to use. So if I'm working with someone on visual systems to track their job tasks, then I'm going to actually have a model that I'm using too, or I'm going to model what they're, how to get through their work before I have them get their hands on it. That model is vital. We know that we learn language through immersion, and that's because you need that level of exposure for your brain to understand how to get definition around a concept. What we do, for the most part, for folks with IDD is we come to them with specific teaching times to cover a topic, or we give them a model for them to use that is not similar to the model that I'm using. So it lacks that need for immersion. It lacks the immersion that is necessary to gain higher level skills. So we're going to talk about some concrete ways to get there. Sugata Mitra is another a researcher from India, and he decided that he was going to study the necessity of a teacher who really understands the topic, how important that is. He's from India. He went back to India, went to a small village, and mud and taped a computer into the wall in a village where they did not yet have exposure to computers. He taught a bunch of kids how to turn it on, how to get online, and how to use the mouse and screen, and then left. And then came back a month later saying, "How are you doing with it?" And they said, "Oh, we don't even look at that thing anymore." And so he's thinking to himself, "Great, I'm going to be the international speaker on this topic. I'm really on the right track." And his next follow-up question is, "What stopped you?" And the kid said, "Well, we programmed it into our language. We found all the free games, but those were too easy. We got through them in 2 weeks. Then it asked us to pay. We're not going to pay." So he actually found out something quite different than he had gone into research, that the environment needs to be rich and the motivation has to be high. So really motivation and rich access are the issues. So we're going to look at the accessibility of a model. We're going to focus on the tactile and kinesthetic and actually visual parts of that for the brain that doesn't process the same way that ours does. And we're going to look at the approach and model. Essentially, how do we start these interactions? I'm going to skip this slide simply because you'll have access to it. And I already said that material. Julie and John Gottman, if you don't know them, own and run the Gottman Institute. John set up a lab at the University of Washington 40 plus years ago and started studying the interactions of couples. And he and his wife, his wife joined him somewhere in the middle of that, and they have identified the things that work in building strong relationships and the things that don't. He is well known for having over 90% accuracy of meeting you and your partner and being able to tell whether or not you're going to be together in 5 years. So of course, some people want to meet him and some people don't. But he's been watching this communication and these interactions for more than 40 years. Some couples, the same couples, have been together that long, and then all the couples who fell apart. And he's been looking at interracial couples, straight and homosexual couples. He's been really varied in who he's, different age couples, and the same kinds of things play out. Go look at his work. It's impressive. But the thing that really resonated for me was this piece. It hit me like a truck when I heard them say this. The beginning of a communication for the first 3 minutes of our interaction is going to predict the outcome of our communication, even when I try to repair something in between. So if I'm working with somebody who has communication issues, or in that social justice lens, right? I have power. I'm going to manage you. That means I have a little bit more power than you. If it is that you are at you're at the response of me setting the expectations, that also brings stress in. Whether it's something you attend to or not anymore, it still is you're lower on the totem pole. So that means that in these interactions, I really want to pay attention to the initial conversation, the initial way that I interact with you. And we've been learning some really good things over the last couple of decades, specifically for folks on the spectrum of autism. If you don't know this book called The Reason I Jump, get it. It's a really good introduction to autism. It's one child's perspective. He wrote it when he was 10 years old with his counselor, and the whole book is set up in Q&A. This is the question that really, again, resonated for me. His counselor says, "Why do you ignore us when we're talking to you?" And he says, "If someone's talking to me from somewhere far off, I don't notice." And you're probably thinking, same here, yes? A major headache for me, though, is that even when someone is right here in front of me, I still don't notice they're talking to me. So it would help us a great deal if you would just use our names first to get our attention before you start talking to us. Now, I've been in the field since I was 13 years old. My dad's a psychiatrist. He was working for developmental centers at the time. I spent every summer hanging out with kids on the spectrum, and we didn't call it that then, but kids on the spectrum and kids with Down syndrome and other, developmental issues. And this was unknown to me. And this is what I mean about the pitchfork and shovel of the institutionalized marginalization. There are things that we don't know. We don't know how to think about this. We have to continue to look for these answers because there are many things that we assume are the same for other people as they are for us. As soon as I read this and started using people's names, it changed the interactions that I had with them. Something else to know, and this is a big issue for us as hearing sighted people who process in similar ways. This model, homunculus, was drawn by an OT to show sensory weight on the body. Where does your body feel and get most sensory information? Hands, mouth, and feet. And you can verify this when you see a baby playing on their back. They've got a toy in their mouth and their hands are in their feet are involved with exploring it because they get the most data there, the most information there. Now, what we do as sighted people, we have this hand-eye coordination. If I'm working with someone, I'm trying to teach them a job and I see that they're touching it incorrectly or they don't quite understand it, our first response is to put our hands on top of theirs and model it. Now, the human body, what that does to us is it engages the startle reflex. You can't turn the startle reflex off. So it doesn't mean that they jump. It doesn't mean that they're, gasping for air, but it means internally their body is saying, what is it? What do you want from me? What is the expectation? And the other thing that happens when my hands are on top of yours and I'm teaching is I'm teaching you cue dependence. People are not born with cue dependence. We teach them to wait for us to instruct them. So instead, we want to get really good at hand under hand. And I've been teaching this concept for 30 years, and I promise you, as much as it might make sense to you, you have to practice it to stop, you kind of have to get a second voice in your own brain saying, wait, instead of putting my hand on top, I'm going to put something underneath. And the way that we encourage people to do that is to get blindfolds. You can cut a strip of 4-inch polar fleece, and that can go in the washer and dryer. And when you're using blindfolds, that's important because your eyes have germs like your mouth does. When we're coming across a new job, I'll blindfold a colleague and teach them without talking so I can get succinct with my hands about how to teach the skill. And we practice this hand under hand demonstration. Because what happens when I'm showing someone, here's the model, and I'm showing them with my hand under theirs, the moment that their intrinsic motivation for mastery kicks in, the moment that they move forward and say, oh yeah, I understand now, I can feel it. I understand that I can back off and let them take over. It changes how I interact with them. It moves what we call from compliance to alliance. Instead of do it the way I'm telling you, I'm your ally to see that when you're ready, I can let you have it. I can, if there's one thing to really focus on, that hand under hand will make a very powerful impact in how people interact with you. It also makes a huge impact in somebody's potential. I actually see more skill sets develop when I offer information that way. So I'm going to move into a couple of concrete systems. People joke, like my colleague Terry Johnson says, we're like the fire hose. We're just going to say, take a sip, and throw a bunch of information at you really quickly. So if there's one thing that you take away today, that hand under hand piece, definitely check that out. I'm going to move into some structured systems. So we started looking at how people process differently and the systems that we're using right now to try to teach them things, and started to create, instead of bringing systems in that might help you organize, to start to create systems side by side with someone and to teach them the system themselves so that they can continue to create it. Now, this is really necessary, again, because the turnover rates are so high in our field. If I work really hard to understand Reed Zimmer, you're going to see him in a slide soon. If I work really hard to understand him and my relationship with him is really strong, and we're good people, right? We're really focusing on how to find that person. Now, we figure something out, and then I go work with someone else and someone new comes in and Reed has to start all over again. If I'm not using my strong relationship with Reed to build a reference system that he can take with him so that no matter who he's working with, he maintains the level of support that he needs and he understands how to get that, then I'm doing a disservice. Now, no shame on us. I mean, right, this is what we've been doing for a long time. I didn't think about this. I've been in the field since I was 13. I'm 57 now. It took me until, 20 years ago to start understanding that maybe I needed to, allow somebody to move forward in a different way. So these portable cameras and printers are one really easy way to do that. because you can take them with you. You can start by, ordering your own coffee and labeling it and using that model and letting somebody else, training somebody else, allowing them to do the same thing, to start to understand how to use this system, because we're going to move into some real structured communication strategies, because like Reed can tell stories that his language cannot. He's non-linguistic. He's got some signs and some articulated words that are hard to understand, but he can use this. He can come to work saying, I rode horses every day on my vacation. I'm a cowboy at heart. And people can interact with him in a much stronger way and develop those natural supports that we're interested in developing in the workplace. Now, this same thing, I'm going to just note real quickly that one of the problems with the systems, most of the systems we use, is that we structure them the way our brain works, the auditory brain. And what we want is to really focus on the visual brain. So if I'm in the picture, then it's a photo album, it's a storytelling tool. If it's about work, instead of Reed does this or Reed taking a picture of Reed doing the work, it's actually from his point of view. In fact, I want him using the camera to take the picture. In fact, we want the boss there saying, Reed, here's the job. Here's the first task, second task. So this is actually his first system. He's now using technology, high tech, but this is our low tech path there. His boss walked through the job site and he took pictures. Reed took pictures of, because we had taught him to use the camera and printer, what the job looked like. Now, Reed was deemed unemployable before we met him by the school and different agencies because he's not able to propel through any structure, any work tasks. He will stand until you tell him what to do next. He just had no independence. This allowed him to propel through his day completely independently, because on the left-hand side were the tasks he needed to do, and when he finished them, he would just move it to the right-hand side. That not only helped Reed understand his boss's expectations, but it also helped the boss understand where he was in his day. It also gave them a system to change things up, like, oh, we're not doing this today, or hey, I want you to do this one first, or the staff could come in and see which rooms were ready for patients. Even abstract things can be concretized, like that clipboard on the bottom of the slide there. There were 3 rooms where there were patients that would come in and out during the day, and there were tasks that he needed to do in those rooms. And once we taught him that was his job, he literally would open the door and stare at the patient like, hey, I have to come in here and clean. Ruh-roh. So we put this clipboard together and we trained him to do what he could, and if a patient was in there, to walk away. And the picture of the clipboard moved down his system all day long, and he would complete everything that he could. And once that clipboard was completely checked off, he could move it to the finished side, but not until then. And then I'm going to skip this next slide, but you can get much more sophisticated and complicated with it. Besides the communication end, we're going to talk about money. This is a hot topic in our community. It's funny, we've kind of rode the coattails of the civil rights movement. So we've got that great money is greed embedded in a lot of us who went through that time period, worked in this field in that time period. And a lot of my colleagues still argue that money is not important to people with disability, with people with developmental disabilities who don't really have access or understand money. I have found something very different to be true. The difference between work and everything else is money and being able to make choices about what I do with that money. Instead of, if I don't understand that my production equals earnings, then that leaves us as the cheerleader of the individual in the workplace. They're working based on the cues that we're giving them or the expectation, instead of I'm making the choice to do it for myself. So we look at, humanizing. We used to say normalizing. We used to say, I've said that for years in my company, that we want to normalize the experience. And then we had a staff person with a disability say, can you call that humanizing instead? Because I don't want to feel like I wasn't normal in the first place. So lesson learned. I'm a permanent student in the School of Hard Knocks. And so this was a great lesson learned, to humanize this. Like, what am I accessing? And if the person I'm working with isn't accessing that same thing, how do we help figure that out? Including who's measuring my performance? How do I track my own tasks? How do I report that information? So we started with some really low-end things like a Money Jig that holds just 4 quarters. Oftentimes when I'm talking about money, the argument I will get was, well, he'd rather have a quarter than $100 bill. It doesn't matter if somebody understands actual coinage or values of different money. That doesn't matter at all. What I want to do is use that camera printer system and take a picture of here's the job, and then you get a quarter, and then here's the next task, and quarter, task quarter, we've earned four, and then we get to buy something right away to connect production and earnings. Let me go back there for a second and just say we don't use people's money to do that, of course, because that's illegal. I can't say I'm going to hold your Social Security money or money you've already earned in this job. We're going to actually find a community sponsor to donate $200 a year to help somebody connect these dots. And we've got a request letter that we use, essentially telling people, you and I connected production and earnings by when we met our first employer, and TREP, for example, has not had the opportunity to do that. So we're asking for $200 specifically to help him make that connection. And we find a sponsor. We've yet to not find a sponsor for someone. It goes really well. We take a little film of it. They come with us and we go present about how it's going. And then, of course, we've got an invested team in his well-being trying to figure out what else he needs. And, of course, then the next thing we get is an iPad. So we and not only that, but a network of people who have, for employment opportunities. So TREP now uses the Work Autonomy app, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, and a Money Jig. But he started with the Money Jig and pictures. And we went to the library and he was doing some volunteering, but we had money involved right away. And this was his, he was, again, somebody deemed unemployable. And we connected the dots between the expectation and the job. And the day that we knew that it really shifted things was the day that he came in a really bad mood. He was just in a, he didn't sleep well the night before. All of the behaviors that we know are problematic were being exhibited that day. And he, in fact, stood up and said, bye-bye, which is like, oh, that's the red alert. Everybody, like, let's shut it down and get out. And I held up the jig, the Money Jig, and said, okay, we can be done, but you don't have the money to buy the hot chocolate. We try not to use food. We have people buy things from the dollar store, but in this particular instance, he wasn't motivated by anything else. There was a Starbucks right next to the library, so he would earn those 4 quarters. We would not walk next door and he would purchase a hot chocolate. That's how long ago this was, that a hot chocolate at Starbucks was less than $1. 15, 16 years ago, something like that. And so he, when he came in and had that terrible day, I held it up and said, that's okay, we can be done. We don't have the money for the hot chocolate. He sat back down in a foul mood, put the gloves back on, the latex gloves back on that are required for the job, and finished the job so that he could get the quarters and buy the hot chocolate. Now, what this shift means is instead of working for me, he's now working for himself. I'm not trying to get him to manage his production. I'm teaching him what his production means, what he can get out of it. And it changed his capacity to work. Chris is a man who worked in a sheltered workshop his entire career, and we did the same thing for him. We put a Money Jig. He took pictures of the tasks, and then we put a time timer. These are old, from 15 years ago. Now we're using iPads for all of this, but and a time timer so he knew how quickly he needed to do something. He went from a sheltered workshop, where he was deemed unemployable for competitive employment, to 2 part-time jobs. He works full-time because all he needed was the capacity to understand the production requirements. We look at kind of in perspective where we are at in our field. And if anybody's old enough here to remember the days when Geraldo Rivera went into an institution on Staten Island and essentially exposed to America for the first time, wow, people are not being cared for, or being very, there's serious concern about people's level of well-being in those institutions. And then we moved into the civil rights movement, and you started to see people with disabilities and advocates in the field saying, hey, civil rights are for everyone, to seeing signs like, you gave us your dimes, now we want our rights. So self-advocacy was starting to really form in the front line. To the school district, where we get the Nothing About Me Without Me and IEPs and PL 94-142, which was the first version of IDEA, to now where we're looking at people in employment. So the perspective is just to understand that we've really been focusing on how do we find the person. This person-centered drive has been vital to understanding how to create better accommodations, how to really understand how to support the person correctly. But the thing that we really haven't paid as much attention to is the employer, our second customer. So we really focus on a two customer model in able opportunities, and this is what we train about. We ask teams, what are the challenges of job development and what is the biggest barrier to employment? Because in our field, this is the conundrum for most of us. We love working with people. It's great to support Reed, but wow, talking to those employers can get exhausting. And we keep running into these barriers. So what are they, and what do we think are the biggest barriers? We've been polling people actually informally before this, but this is 10 years of data. This is that we've calculated. And we look at the support system. So CRPs like us, residential support staff, families, teachers, we've polled over 1,000 people to get this data. And most of us believe that the number one barrier is employer attitudes and their lack of awareness. And then we think secondary to that is a lack of motivation to work, that the person would rather not work. And then family beliefs, and then transportation, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we also asked employers, and they tell us a different story. They tell us that they don't have the capacity, which means I don't have the money or the time right now. We have built a capacity model with employers, teaching them essentially that this is a charity project. Our payment system helped structure that. Our desperation to kind of break through the barriers of the workplace helped build that. At this point in time, we really need to address it. And we address that by helping build very strong business model tools. I just want to point out that their number one issue is the no capacity. Their number two issue is they've had a bad experience. Now, our lack of standardization builds that, right? They can work with one agency and get something entirely different than what they get from somebody else. And I also want to point out that the fear of safety and the fear that somebody doesn't have the work skills or a bad experience with a person with a disability are the last three issues for the employers. So interesting, what we think is the problem is not really where it lives for the employer. So some other things that help inform our information about this is, the number one reason person with IDD loses their job is a change in supervisor. And then what does that tell us? It tells us that the new supervisor comes in and essentially looks at this employee or this employer and, this affirmative action hiring initiative, whatever it is, if it's one person or more, and sees Jerry's kids and says, I didn't do this. I don't have the time or the money to attend to this right now. So it means the employer doesn't see the employee as an employee. Also, as we said before, if an employer has a bad experience with one of us, they're understandably reluctant to let us on the floor to hire somebody else. And then this fact that we don't have business-minded standardized practices is hurting us. We continue to bring the same problems with us, where we teach people to talk to employers like they're friends, to not even tell them you're a job developer. We teach people to all kinds of things. We get more sophisticated about it, but we haven't really cracked the nut. We haven't really changed our mission in talking with employers. Now, many employers, most employers want to do the right thing. It's not that we can't, build a relationship with them. That's going to be a long-term important piece. But we do want to get to the math to break the myth right out the gate. We used our collaboration with Harrison Medical Center. We wrote a project and have been in business with them, in partnership with them since 2005. We couldn't get them to look at a resume, and my colleagues said they don't hire people with disabilities. And I went to the HR department and told them what people were saying about them, and the woman in the HR department that day was the right person to meet, and she worked hard with me and our county coordinator to write a project specifically to help them hire people with IDD. And it grew exponentially really quickly because we made film about it and we really focused on the business end of things. So we're going to look at some of that business-minded practice. We go in and develop cost analysis. This is our very first one from Harrison, where we were pitching a $9.55 beginning hourly rate when the minimum wage was $7.25. So people now are making really good money. This is our very first one. We essentially went in, observed a department and said, wow, I'm watching different people stock your medical supplies. People are running out of things back and forth, and sometimes it's an LPN or a CNA or your clerks, your med clerks or office clerks. And we did the math of calculating how much money they were spending letting those people complete those tasks. And then customizing the position, we pulled those tasks off of higher paid, cross trained staff and created positions for WIN. The project at Harrison is called WIN, Work Independence Network. And so we put the math together over a 5-year period too to help them project what this was costing them. So in this very first piece, we're looking at a 12-hour-a-week job that can save the department up to $23,000 over a 5-year period. Now, this is what businesses need. They need to understand that there's a really smart reason to do this in order to sustain it. At Harrison, in fact, they got bought out by a larger health initiative. And the new HR director, when I called her to introduce myself, said, "Oh yeah, we're not going to be able to do this program anymore." I swallowed the freak out that I experienced the moment she said it, and asked her for an appointment specifically to talk to her about this business-minded stuff because she didn't know us. And we came in with cost analysis for every single position at the hospital. We also came in with production charts. You're going to see those in a minute. And she looked over this and said, "Can you do this for us in these 2 other sites?" So instead of being the capacity model, we quickly went to a business partner who's going to help them with their efficiency. In fact, we call ourselves business efficiency specialists. We also look at normalizing, and again, I'm going to have to change the slide because it's humanizing work, breaking the cycle. A family has a child with a disability and they have to create new dreams because they probably weren't expecting that child with a disability. They set new goals, new dreams, and then the child goes to school and has a teacher and a para who work hard to help them reach those dreams and gain the skill sets in order to reach those dreams. And then you go to work with a job coach. Now, the job coach looks and feels like the teacher and the para and like parents. That shift of relationship and the loss of that shift of relationship is really hurting motivation and production. You and I know that we met our first boss and had an entirely different experience than any other relationship before it. And that shift in relationship is necessary for every one of us to understand the expectations of work. That employer relationship has to be established and has to be strong because that's what influences my production and my performance. So we use accommodations right out the gate. In fact, we wrote a standard operating procedure. I'm not going to talk about this today other than to mention it. In our corporate consultation, we wrote a standard operating procedure for employers to understand how to work with us so that they get a standardized model. And it includes the request for video resumes and interviews because video resumes allow an employer to decide who to hire based on their skill set instead of Jennifer White's opinion about who's qualified for the job, right? That's kind of our model now is they look to us to help them understand who can do the job. And we want them to have a direct information about that. And we want their potential new employee to have a direct relationship with them talking about what their skill set is. So video resumes are one solution to that. We also work on reference tools so that the employee can capture first of all, capture their employer's expectations, track it, and report directly to their employer. When we talked about the dynamic plan, we on our staff meeting notes have a section called "How do we get out of the way?" And this is what we look at to put in that category. Am I frustrated with an employee, a parent, or an employer? Pretty much those are if we're triggered by, that parent's they're crazy if they think their kid can work more, or that employer's discriminatory practice, or gosh, I've been teaching Eric how to do this for too long and he's not picking up the skill. If I start to get frustrated, it tells us that there's something we need to invent there because our personal relationship in it means that there's a lack of concrete reference for somebody. So we want to build concrete reference tools. You're seeing Eric here on the Work Autonomy app. And when we first built the app, he came with us to present at APSI. Somebody asked him how he likes the app, and he said, "I like the Work Autonomy app because I can do my job and the job coach can go away." That's who we want in the workplace, right? The person who can do that themselves. I'm going to skip this slide because I'm already referencing it and you can talk about it later. But here's what we learned. Here was the big lesson for why we had to build it. The chart, the concrete referencing. One of the jobs at Harrison was in a labor and delivery nursing floor, and the woman who got hired had more stress and anxiety about people than almost anyone I've met, and I've met a lot of people with anxiety. So she was as white knuckled as could be. Her head was down. She didn't make eye contact with her coworkers. She was doing the job well, but she wasn't interacting. And then one day she found out that the Huck nurse has a dog like hers. And the two of them started talking about dogs, and the floodgates opened. And so now everyone's celebrating that here's Abby. We finally get to meet the woman behind the anxiety. And then over a period of 2 weeks, she's getting so involved with her colleagues and interacting with them that she's no longer producing. She's no longer doing the job they're paying her for, and they don't know how to talk to her about it. So she's essentially getting her feedback from people being happy to see her and equating that with I'm doing my job. Now, again, we're trying to teach her that, but instead we want her to have a concrete reference of what that means. And we want it to come from the boss, not us, because we're mom on the job site, whether we want to be or not. So this is her original chart that we built. We just used an Excel spreadsheet and put down, kind of we gave her a timer, and she was already using a checklist. So she was writing down next to each task how much time it was taking her. And this is the beginning of her production chart. She was only working 50% of the time that they were paying her. So her boss sat down with us. We trained the boss and Abby to use this chart and had the boss set the bar at the expectations of how many and how long this should be happening. And it took her, you can see by the end of 2 weeks, she was meeting the bar and she never went below the bar again because the boss said to her, if you want to keep this job, I have to see this every day. And then after this got stabilized, her boss got to raise the bar and say, if you want more hours and more money, I need to see this every day. So we built essentially the accommodation tool for the employer to be the supervisor of their own employee. The other address that we want is understanding what your earnings are and how your work behavior impacts that. We work with someone with fetal alcohol syndrome who was cutting out early. She was checking with the boss, like her vital, tasks were done, and then she was cutting out earlier. She was coming in late. And we worked, forever on the ethics of why you must go to work on time and stay your whole shift, and it made no impact. I mean, it did temporarily, but fetal alcohol syndrome, and she's struggling with those executive functions. So instead, we put this simple chart together, and the time that she would put in was check-in time and check-out time. How many minutes did I work in this shift? And it showed her the money that she was losing based on her salary. And then instead of trying to talk to her about the ethical parts, although we still did that, we also talked about, oh, you lost $25 this week. Isn't that dinner for you and your friend at Olive Garden? Bummer. Aren't you saving up for an Xbox? Oh, I'm sorry. That's going to hurt those savings. So we put it in concrete context into the things that were motivating for her, and that's when we saw impact. Now, we've got these amazing tools accessible to us now around, iPads. Steve Jobs, bless his heart, changed the game because this tool is made for that visual brain that we talked about in those earlier slides. We're proponents of iPads. We love Microsoft. We love their ethics. We'd love to be buying more of their devices, but their devices are not as accessible to this population as the iPad because it's made for the visual brain. I put a lot of slides in here that we're not going to go through, but I wanted you to have access to them because some of it is teaching around some of these tools. But essentially, we want to humanize this experience for folks with cognitive disabilities. These are all the ways I'm using my phone. It's changed my life, right? It's changed my ability to organize myself, communicate, all of those things. And I want Reed to have the same access. So I want to evaluate his capacity to use that tool, and I want to create the expectations of how to do it or the access, the accommodations about how to do that. On these slides, you're going to be able to run through yourself kind of how we start with somebody. We use these kinds of tools to play with it. And then we have tools that we have our staff learn about, and how we use these tools are all listed in here. Some of these I definitely want to talk about though. The camera is probably the most used tool that we have, because if someone can capture and track their own information in a way that helps them process it, and visual information and tactile information are stronger for most human beings. That's what universal design is mostly falls down to, is something that's more visually accessible or tactily accessible. So we take pictures to show people the environments they're going to be going into when we're doing an evaluation or coming into a new job site. We use film for video resumes, for people to make their own self-advocacy films, for them to capture person-centered planning. We use it for lots of different reasons, and we find that people learning how to make their own films is one of the best ways to teach self-determination, choice making, organization. Anyway, it's like painting the fence in Huckleberry Finn, right? Like, it's so much fun, you don't even know that you're learning higher level skills. So for employer engagement, we have video brochures, marketing brochures. We make tools that help people learn how to do it. We do screenshot kind of trainings. We do visual trainings for people with disabilities to learn those tools as well. And to note that every device has, go to these websites, there's accessibility features on all of the devices. I list out a couple things here around tools that we use, like travel safety apps, and how we use FaceTime and video calls for safe travel, and mapping apps to do the same thing. We look at Notability, which is a cool tool for capturing, taking pictures and writing on it and highlighting things. There's some things in here like StoryKit and ChoiceWorks, which is what we see mostly teams using for someone to track their own tasks. And then Work Autonomy is the app that we built to kind of elevate all of those tools we've been talking about that focus on money and production and communication, is built into this app. So I'm going to encourage you to go to our website, or you can go to the App Store and look at Work Autonomy app. It allows somebody to capture, track, and report their own information to their employer. It also has a little section that helps people play messages back and forth between home and the workplace. So some natural supports, like Reed comes in and has a little video from his brother, like, "Hi, I'm Reed's brother, and here's my new baby, Reed's new nephew." And the doctor who works in the urgent care where Reed is working, pulls his phone out and goes, "Oh, cool, look, I went skiing." So now they have this way to connect that they didn't in the past. But the most important part is that the time timers, the clock and the timer and the counter, that allow the person to understand the expectations of the employer. And then the chart that produces it allows the employer and the employee to reference it on a regular basis and make sure that work performance is staying steady. So we look at technology as the great equalizer, and these are the questions that we continue to ask about, good, how do we get there? How do we make sure that we're on target with those? And I just love to quote Mark Twain. He says, a habit cannot be tossed out a window. It must be coaxed down the stairs a step at a time. We offer facilitated meetings. We cover these kinds of topics to help companies understand how to implement something, knowing that it's going to require a dynamic plan, that it's not just we're going to buy a bunch of iPads, because we're going to need to buy iPads, but the iPads are not going to just be a way that we do our job. It's going to be something that's going to help us learn how to do our job differently. And that takes time. You want to make sure that you have the time in your schedule to do that. You've made time for training and staff education. But I'll tell you that for me as an employer with my own staff, when we implemented iPads for everybody, we cut our paperwork we cut our paperwork time in half. 50% less paperwork time. That paid for the iPads in 2 months. So just to know that there's huge benefit to efficiency, not only for your own staff, but also huge benefit for accommodations. And with my staff having the iPads in hand, that also allows a set for the model, like we talked about, that immersion. They're modeling how to use these very accessible tools to all of the folks that we support. I'm just going to leave my contact information up to say that anytime you can contact me if you have questions about someone in particular that you're trying to use one of these tools for. If I said something that kind of made sense to you, but you want more information, I'm going to note that you should cross out that office line. I finally let go of the office line. We're paying for a landline and not using it. So do use my cell or email if you want information. And note that it can take me, because I travel a lot, it might take me 2 weeks to get back to you. I want to leave some time for questions and answers. I know I just fire hosed right through all of that information, but essentially, in a nutshell, I want the two customer model, where I'm paying attention to building accommodation tools for the employer and also the employee, and I want to move for the employee from person-centered to person-driven. Where's their reference tool that I'm leaving them with, so that regardless of where they're going or who they're working with, they've got the accommodation that holds the bar in the right place over the long term. Deep breath. All right, I'd love to just check in and see around questions or anything that I've touched on that you'd like a little bit more information about.
So, Jen, this is Trish. We have one question from Stacy Martin, and she says, "What suggestions do you have for a person that refuses to have a job coach but needs some minor assistance with communication with the supervisor? And we're quite certain we can help in some
Great,
other areas if he would just let us in."
brilliant. So again, we work with what's the human experience. So if you, for example, needed some coaching or some training to elevate your skill, to keep your job, or to advance in your job, what would your company do for you? They'd bring somebody in. But your boss would be having that conversation with you. So what we do is we educate the employer about the need for the assistance, and the employer talks to their employee saying, we coach them with some ways to talk about it. You're doing a great job. We love to have you here, but these things are missing. So it's like getting a performance plan together from the employer, a corrective action plan or a performance plan, saying this is what I need you to learn how to do, and I'm gonna request that Jennifer be here to work on that with you. Here's how we're going to measure the outcome so we can stop having her come. So that the employer is setting the bar in the right place. Seeing you say, can we talk to the employer with a signed consent? So this is somebody, so I think I need a little bit more information from you, Stacy, because I'm seeing your follow-up question about can we talk to the employer with a signed consent? So you're not a coach? You haven't already been in touch with this employer, is that correct? Stacy's typing, you guys, just so you know. In, no, he got the job on his own. Yeah, so this is the human experience. I get jobs on my own too. Right? If he got this job on his own and he doesn't want to do it, then he's going to hit his own natural consequences. He the thing that I want to know, what I want to address the most is I understand why he wants to do it on his own, and I understand that he's been managed most of his life. So what I need to address, just like when I'm working with the employer, if I see them roll their eyes or I see that discriminatory practice kind of coming towards me or that exhaustion, I have to immediately interject. I understand that we did this to you, right? Our field has kind of built this capacity model, blah, blah, blah. And I give them more tools around cost analysis and performance tracking and all of that. In the same way that when I'm working with the individual with a developmental disability, I get to say, I know you don't want me there, right? I understand that. It feels like you're doing a great job. Here's what we want to talk about. I can work with you to with a design that you can bring to your employer, because this might help you get more money or more hours. And then it's the person's choice. That's as much as we can do. But really the mindset is, how do I talk to this person so that they understand that I understand the motivation for them, not to want somebody invading my space essentially, or managing me, especially because it's my confidence with an employer is set really high. If he got the job himself, I'm sure he feels very good about it. Now, if he says it's okay for you to have a conversation with the employer, or even just to have a meeting with all three of you together, I would come to that meeting prepared with some models of what could be possible, so to have the accommodation ideas ready for the discussion. All right, thanks. Stacy wrote, okay, thanks, that was great. Good. All right. And then somebody else put up a website. Anybody else have a question or a comment? Well, I certainly am grateful to have this time with you all today. And our website has some information and some models on it, including like a workshop I'm doing, or a worksheet for filling out a video resume, and some other tools. So please go check out the website and do connect with me if there's anything I can do. Trisha, I'm sorry I cut you off there.
You're just fine. I was just going to type in the chat box for people to please take the survey. ODEP loves it when we let them know what we shared and how people felt about it. And then we also have a certificate that you can download for watching this webinar, and keep track of that when you need to show your continuing education credits or just your training logs. This is also recorded, so if you want to share this with staff or are just interested in maybe going back, if you joined us late, we did record this meeting and it will be on the Utah State University Center for Persons with Disabilities website. Um, Corbin, the real Corbin, if you wanted to maybe put in the website where the link will be available, that would be fantastic.
And I'm just going to add, this
Okay.
is Jennifer again, I'm just going to add too that all of the tools that we're talking about, we have written information about. So if you'd like a link to something, or if you'd like the production charts, if you're not interested in using technology for it, we still have those Excel spreadsheets that we developed that are autofill for you, so you don't have to recreate that tool. Or more information about how to use iPads and apps, that kind of thing, please reach out. I'd be happy to share information with you.
Wonderful. So for those of you who are going to be involved in the all-day training next week, we plan on starting at 9 o'clock, and we'll have some breaks and then also lunch. And then again, we're going to be offering those who are traveling long distances or just not able to be here to join by Adobe Connect. We will be sending out a confirmation email to those who have registered for this event to make sure that you are in fact going to attend in person. We have a room size limitation, so if there are folks that are not going to be able to do that, then we want to make space for those who can commit. So look for an email. If most folks did the intro, also signed up for the all day event, but I just want to kind of make sure because we had quite a few folks that registered for this event but didn't get on. But anyway, so look for that email, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Tricia.
Thank you.